So welcome you all here this evening, both those of you who are present here on the premises, some having traveled as far as London on this beautiful December evening, cold and rainy. Thank you for coming. And also those joining us on Zoom, especially those from the Coptic Church or the Coptic Archdiocese here in England or in London. I would also say it's wonderful to welcome Professor Peter Bouteneff to the Institute this evening, except that he's been with us for almost 3 months as a sabbatical scholar. So we welcomed him a while ago. But Peter, thank you for accepting to deliver this talk this evening. So welcome in a sense formally as a speaker to the Institute this evening. Welcome also again to his wife Patricia. They were both with us here. Patricia gave a wonderful talk not too many days ago on the Feast of St. Catherine for us. Thank you for that. When Peter is not at IOCS, he teaches courses in ancient and modern theology and spirituality at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in New York, where he is professor of systematic theology and Kulik professor of sacred arts. Peter earned his undergraduate degree in music. Then he received an MDiv from St. Vladimir's Seminary, then an MPhil and a DPhil from Oxford University, where he studied under Bishop Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, of blessed memory now. Peter has worked for many years in theological dialogue, notably as Executive Secretary for Faith and Order at the World Council of Churches, and has written extensively on Orthodox theology and Orthodox relations with other churches. He conceived of and edits the Foundation series of St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, to which he has contributed a widely popular volume called Sweeter Than Honey, Orthodox Thinking on Dogma and Truth. He's also, among other titles, the author of Beginnings, Ancient Christian Readings of the Biblical Creation Narrative. My favorite book of Peter's is How to Be a Sinner, which I thoroughly recommend. It's a very small book, but packs a punch. Thank you. I have, on his IOCS sabbatical time here at IOCS, he has been working on a book with the topic of the theological reconciliation between Eastern and Oriental churches. And the book, as we understand from Peter, intends to revisit the early history as well as the modern dialogues between the two family of Orthodox churches. I have every confidence that both Peter's forthcoming book and this evening's lecture will make a relevant contribution to the mutual dialogue between the Eastern and the Oriental Orthodox, which with God's help will eventually bring about the restoration of sacramental communion. We do, after all, pray at every divine liturgy for the unity of all. So that's enough for me. Peter, I and we all look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the administration of this institute and the board and the donors who made my sabbatical fellowship a possibility. I'm just grateful beyond words for these past 2 months that we've been able to spend here and work in an unconstrained way. It's been a blessing beyond imagination. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak this evening, and for those of you who traveled from London, from Oxford. My dear friend Alexander Lingus is here from Oxford, and I'm happy to be joined on Zoom by many people, some familiar faces and some new friends. So let me put something really exciting on the screen. That's the title of our talk tonight. As we embark upon it, I'm about to show you an outline of what I'd like to speak about tonight. And it's a big title, and it seems to promise to treat the entire issue of a 1500-year schism between two families of churches. This will not be a comprehensive talk. It will not be the be-all and end-all of this topic. It will be an introduction. Well, let me tell you, well, here's an outline of what it's going to be. It's going to be a brief review of the situation of the schism, identifying the churches involved in the schism, the reasons for division, just very, very broad outline of these things, discussing, or at least introducing the main theological issues and how we might regard them. I think that's going to really be the key, is how we might regard these issues. And I say concluding remarks on the fathers because I was at a meeting of the Moscow Theological Commission, the Moscow Patriarchate Theological Commission in the 1990s, when they were reviewing a document that had recently been produced at Chambézy, the closing statement of the great theological dialogue between the Eastern and Oriental churches. And the question facing the commission, at which I was a guest, was, is this document orthodox? And to those who said that it was, a very sharp question was posed. And that question was, do we think we are smarter than the fathers of the 5th century, who, after all, anathematized the so-called monophysites in their day? Do we think we're so much smarter than they are? And so I was always kind of pierced by that question from now 30 years ago. And I've been pierced by it ever since, and especially as someone who teaches at an Orthodox seminary that has a very large percentage of students from the Oriental churches. Having worked prior to that at the World Council of Churches, where the voice and the face of the Orthodox is a unified voice and a unified face among Eastern and Oriental Orthodox. So I'm coming from this background, and I am pierced by this question of, are we smarter than the fathers? So that's part of really what's informing my project that I've been working on while on sabbatical here, and which I will continue to work on by your prayers over the year that I will continue to be on sabbatical from my teaching post at St. Vladimir Seminary. So let's proceed. The situation of the schism. So the councils, as they were known, as they were received, up until the 5th century, were the first council in Nicaea in AD 325, the first council in Constantinople, AD 382. Wait, that was 381. I think I made a mistake on my slide. Ephesus in AD 431. And then, because Ephesus was seen not to have been conclusive, and because of a lot of issues that arose in the ensuing 20 years after Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon was summoned and attempted to come up with a settlement of a long festering problem in how to describe the person of Christ. Now, a book came out in the 1990s called Does Chalcedon Divide or Unite? And I think that's an interesting title that asks an interesting question about Chalcedon, because evidently it does both. It unites the Orthodox Christians who are adherents, who received and accept the council as authoritative, as do I. But it also has divided others from that body because of a lot of reasons that are partly political and partly terminological. So it is that schism and the churches that weren't even at Chalcedon that eventually would reject it, that is still plaguing us to this day, such that the churches, I will now name them, and the two families are out of communion with each other. As we know, the Eastern Orthodox Church today, the Chalcedonian Orthodox Church, is often called just the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church in some cases, or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Also very interesting then is how we name those churches that are non-Chalcedonian. and there are different names for them. The non-Chalcedonian churches is accurate, but it's perhaps not exactly attractive to refer to an entire family of churches through a negation, the non-something. Oriental Orthodox Church is a name with an interesting provenance. This name was arrived at in the 1960s when the Chalcedonian churches first, and the non-Chalcedonian churches began to encounter each other in the context of the World Council of Churches. And there was an intuition already and a very clear sense of rapprochement that was in the air between these two families of churches. Now, I say two families of churches. By that point, the churches whom we know as non-Chalcedonian did not necessarily consider themselves as a family. If you asked an Armenian apostolic Christian whether they were brothers and sisters with the Ethiopian or Eritrean churches, they would say, with whom? But through the dialogue, we witness the birth of a family of churches whose identities I'm about to project on the screen. And the name Oriental was agreed because it is, well, in some languages, it's even literally synonymous with Eastern. If you think of French, for example, because this placed the two sides, the two families, on a par with each other, even as to their name, right? So hence, Eastern and Oriental churches, at points in history, they are called monophysite, referring to one nature in Christ. But over time, the name miaphysite is understood as much more theologically accurate because it, in fact, it represents the signature phrase of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, a saint common to all of our churches. And that phrase is mia physis tu theologus es archomene. I'll discuss it a little bit later. But long story short, in our day, this family of churches is also identified as the miaphysite churches. So without reading all of these, this is the Eastern Orthodox today. It began as a much simpler, shorter list, but over time it grows. Just so you know who the, as it were, players are. And in the Oriental churches, the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria, Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church, Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, and as an eparchy of the Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, the Malankara Syrian Orthodox Church, then the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, whose autocephaly is not fully recognized by Syria, and the Armenian Apostolic Church. As with the previous list of Eastern churches, there are also, troubles and schisms within, but as a simple list, this I think holds and is still useful. So the Eastern and the Oriental are these two families of churches, the Oriental really emerging as a family only in the second part of the 20th century through the dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox Church. Does that all make sense so far? Okay, here we go. So as I've mentioned, the places where the Eastern and Oriental churches are experienced as a kind of a unity, even as they are out of communion with each other, include some of the interchurch organizations, certainly the World Council of Churches, to a degree also the Middle East Council of Churches and other local councils of churches, seminaries, notably St. Vladimir's, where I think 30 to 40% of our students are either from the Malankara families of churches, the Armenian Church, with whose seminary we have a sister seminary agreement. We share faculty and students, St. Nurse's Seminary, as well as Coptic students. Sometimes also, we recently graduated an Eritrean student, as well as from the Syrian family. So all that by God's grace, and all of it kind of being, giving a glimpse as to what unity might look like. You know, sharing classrooms, sharing meals, sharing fellowship, sharing education. It's a seminary of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and we teach Chalcedonian Christology, but we teach it in ways that account for that large swath of Christians who are right in our classroom who have not received Chalcedon, and we discuss why and all of that, right? So these contexts of the unity that already exist now are important, and I would add as a major, territorial context of unity is the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, right, and in Sinai, where Eastern and Oriental Christians live side by side, and they intermarry, and there are pastoral agreements, especially in the churches in Antioch, for example, that do permit a kind of a limited intercommunion and recognition of each other's baptisms and ministries, etc. So it is in these contexts of union that, again, we get a glimpse of what it may, in God's time and by God's grace, if God wills, what it may look like as a unified reality. And so another context of union then is the dialogue that, again, began under the auspices of the World Council of Churches. People who see that organization as a negative reality may then all the more frown on this dialogue, but this is simply the context where these churches first began to encounter each other as human beings, where they began to humanize each other and see who that other is with whom we've been out of communion now for 1,500 years. And so from the early 60s began a process that began with 4 unofficial dialogues, unofficial in that the personnel were not named by the member churches, but they were gathered and named. And these personnel were not naifs, nor were they ecumenical softies. They were people like Father George Florovsky, Father John Romanides, then John Zizioulis, people like V.C. Samuel from the Malankara Church, Tiran Nefsoyan of the Armenian Church. These were like major heavy hitter theologians. So the dialogues immediately began in both seriousness and a spirit of hope. Spirit of hope is evident in all of their proceedings. So these 4 unofficial dialogues, it's often wise to kind of begin quietly and unofficially, and then the churches take note and say, let's make this official. And so the primates of the churches and their kind of external church relations commissions, etc., named the personnel who would be the official dialogue participants, which take us into the 1990s. And I will quote just a little bit later on from the what is now the final statement of that dialogue. It's not the final statement on this entire relationship because it needs a little more work, but the final statement, which is the second agreed statement, which arose from Chambézy, Switzerland. All right, so the co-chairs of the dialogue at that point were Metropolitan Damaskinos of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, who was living in Chambézy, and Metropolitan Bishoy of Damietta, a leading Coptic theologian who reposed only a couple of years ago and with whom I was a close friend. These were the co-chairs of that dialogue. Right. Where are we going? So where we're going is to discuss, at least briefly, the causes of division, and really very briefly. And I would say, first and foremost, among them is theology, Christology. One of the ways in which we know that we are truly one with one another spiritually is how seriously we all take theology, Eastern and Oriental Christians, how seriously we take liturgy, how seriously we take the church fathers. You know, an encounter between Eastern and Oriental Christians is an encounter of brothers and sisters. And so we take theology seriously, and the ways in which Christology specifically were expressed from the 4th and 5th centuries onward were a matter of contestation. And it's not surprising that in the context of the 5th century, that there was a perception that the two sides were saying different things. Already there you have a hint of an answer to that question. Are we smarter than the fathers? No, we're not. We just have more information than they did, all right? But at the time, it made sense to indeed be divided, because the terms with which the person of Christ was described were different and seemed to be in opposition from each other. And so with that is the difference of which councils do we understand as ecumenical, which are the councils that we see ourselves under their authority, right? And so obviously for the non-Chalcedonians, those councils are Nicaea I, Constantinople I, and Ephesus I. And for us, you keep the list going. Chalcedon, Constantinople II, Constantinople III, and Nicaea II, the 7th ecumenical council in the 8th century. Okay, so that's a matter of contestation, which councils are recognized as ecumenical. As a result, saints are contested because there are people whom the non-Chalcedonians revere as saints, namely Dioscorus and Severus, who can, in many circles within the Eastern Orthodox Church, be regarded as heretics. And our saint, Pope Leo I, is regarded as a heretic by the non-Chalcedonians. So there's issues there that have to be dealt with that stem from the theological and conciliary issues. Liturgies. As I mentioned, we take our liturgies very, very seriously, and the liturgies in use in the Eastern Orthodox Church it's very clear what they are and what the sanctioned liturgies are, limited in number, primarily the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, Liturgy of St. Basil the Great, the Presanctified Liturgy of St. Gregory the Dialogist, and the Liturgy of St. James in a limited way, all right? In the Oriental churches, there is a greater diversity of liturgies. Many of the structures of them are extremely familiar to the Eastern Orthodox, but they're different liturgies. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, especially where the liturgy is as codified as it is, any divergence is felt very, very deeply. And it's very difficult for us in the Eastern Orthodox Church to dissociate a liturgical divergence from a total tear in the fabric. And so a lot of that is a matter of just familiarity with each of the liturgies, but it's a point of division, no doubt. And then I would just say that on another level, the reason for our division to this day is habit. We are used to the structures that we are in. We are used to the liturgies that we attend. We are used to the ways in which we refer to the person of Christ. With good reason, we're used to it. But especially in contexts where the face of orthodoxy is more or less homogeneous. So in Russia and Greece, for example, there are virtually no Oriental Orthodox Christians. In Russia, there's a sizable Armenian contingent, so there is that. But in the vast majority of geographical regions there, and really in the Slavic countries and in the Balkans, there's a very minimal Oriental presence. In India, there's a very minimal Eastern Orthodox presence, you know. And there's a feeling in such areas of, why do we need unity with anybody else? We're doing fine as we are. We're the Orthodox Church. What could happen? Right? So there's habit and even, I would say, desire, because I don't want to get too deeply into the psychological and spiritual dimensions of this, but the movement towards conciliarity and towards unity with someone we have long perceived as an other is extremely challenging. It makes us rethink many positions that we have held fast to, often for very good reason, but maybe not always for good reason. It's very difficult. Unity is very difficult, as anyone in a marriage or in a family or in a complex institution knows. Unity, conciliarity is a challenge. And in many ways, it's a lot simpler to remain just as we are. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so this issue of habit and desire, I think, cannot be overstressed. With that said, I won't mention it again tonight, but I did want to at least put it forward as an issue involved. So my own current project, just to be very, very brief, because you need to know what I'm up to. I am working on, what I've been working on while here in Cambridge is especially concerning terminology and councils. So the central portion of my book at this point is going to concern, well, the 7 councils that the Eastern Orthodox regard as ecumenical, and how they came to be, who the main persons are, and the main documents of them. But you know, there are many texts that walk us through the councils and their theology. This doesn't aim to be just yet another way to Nicaea or Nicene faith or the search for the Christian doctrine of God or Grillmeyer's Christ in Eastern Christian tradition. It doesn't aim to be another one. It aims to take a purposeful look at these councils through the lens of this division and this relationship of the Eastern and Oriental churches. Because when I speak later about the dialogue and its acceptance and its rejection, its very strenuous rejection by the sacred community of Mount Athos, for example, these are issues that are of paramount importance and they need a response. So what I'm finding very briefly, as I'll show you as I continue this evening, is, well, it's no surprise to know that over the centuries that we regard as the conciliar period, one of the paramount issues was the search for the terminology that would appropriately describe who God is and specifically who Jesus Christ is. And that terminology came from, you know, in the councils, the terminology came from the Greek philosophical world. And it was a matter of how to adapt that terminology properly. And there were centuries during which not everybody adapted it in the same way. And what we find, what I aim to show is what the fathers did in the meantime, how they prioritized meanings over terms. Okay, I'll say more about that tonight. But I'm also writing about the councils themselves, how we count them, how we understand their authority. And I ask the question, can we do as the fathers did and give priority to meaning and faith over not only specifically the terms involved, but even the number of councils that we revere? All right, so that's what I'm up to, and that's why we're all in the room together discussing this theme. So I'm really going to focus now on Christology, the person of Christ, and what the terminological issues are there, at least briefly. As I said, tonight is not a comprehensive survey of this issue. It's a bare bones kind of presentation. So what's evident to the fathers and to us is that when we read the Gospels, we see Christ saying and doing things that are, on the one hand, only God can say and do. I am the resurrection and the life. Lazarus, come forth. I am the bread of life. And then he also says and does things that are commensurate with human, vulnerable, passible, mortal humanity. I thirst. Where have you laid him? I know not the day nor the hour. Right? So there's hunger, thirst. There is temptation. Well, there is not sin, but there is temptation. And so the challenge of the conciliar era is to express how this one person can embody two opposing realities, at the same time uncreated and created, impassible and vulnerable, immortal and evidently mortal, because he dies. That's the whole challenge. And I think our entry into the mystery of theology and patristic theology and into this whole question of Christology, it has to be truly bitten by the enormity of this question. We have to allow ourselves to also be utterly perplexed and amazed by the incarnation, rather than think that if we've mastered terms like hypostasis and thesis and usia, we've got Christ in our pockets. God forbid. We have to enter into the mystery of the faith. So one of the ways that the solutions were arrived at by the church was owing to the wrong solutions that were presented along the way, owing to what we understand as heresies. All right, and so some of the wrong solutions. One of the earliest heresies on record, because it's on record even in the New Testament, is Docetism, the idea that Christ only appeared to be human. He only appeared to take human flesh. He was a phantom who appeared to be human. That's one way to figure out why he said, I thirst. Well, he was just pretending, right? So reject that solution. Another solution was that he wasn't really fully divine, right? So that the Logos of God, the second person of the Trinity, was a kind of a second-class divinity. That was another way to kind of solve the question of how one person could be both human and divine. Well, he wasn't really human, or he wasn't really divine. Now, as the centuries progress and as we approach Chalcedon, two more important incorrect solutions presented themselves, and one of them was to say, well, actually, the human being born of Mary was merely a human being. but a special one, because he was in a profound union with the second person of the Trinity, the Logos of God. So at its most egregious, Nestorianism is effectively saying that Jesus Christ was two subjects of identity, the human Jesus and the divine Jesus. I mean, it's like profoundly schizophrenic. So I thirst and I am are really being said by two different personalities. Unacceptable. And then a final incorrect solution is to say that, well, basically, okay, yes, he was born of Mary, the Theotokos, but his humanity, what is humanity before God? It's a good question. His humanity was entirely swallowed up by his divinity. So there's really only one nature in Christ, and it's the divine nature. Christ is not the same as us. So all of these are really helpful wrong solutions, because you can say, my beloved teacher, Bishop Callistos, used to say, it's kind of like seeing a road sign, the road to Edinburgh is not that way, so you know where you're not going, and if you have enough signs that say you're not going there, you're going to end up going to Edinburgh. So it's these heresies that everyone wants to avoid, Eastern and Oriental. I think that's a really important point to remember, because those who, from among the Eastern churches, and really, by the way, I'm writing this book and addressing mostly my brothers and sisters in the Eastern Orthodox Church, because they're the only ones I know how to convince, right? When the Eastern Orthodox call the Oriental Orthodox monophysites or heretics, as some of them love to do, they are accusing them of this heresy, Eutychianism, which is the heresy that Christ is actually not of the same substance as us human beings. And that is a heresy. But guess what? The Oriental Orthodox also condemn it as a heresy. Okay? So those who enjoy bandying that word around and applying it to everyone who is not exactly us really need to be careful. All right? So that's the wrong solutions. Now, two sides of brilliant theologians are trying to come up with the right solutions. And at Chalcedon, the solution in short is that Jesus Christ is one and the same person, known in two natures. Specifically, Chalcedon says that Christ, as the Son of God the Father, is therefore consubstantial with God the Father. What you are the child of is what you are. And this same Christ, who is consubstantial with the Father, was also born of Mary. He's the son of the Theotokos, and ever Virgin Mary, therefore consubstantial with her and us. That's the top portion of the Chalcedonian definition. And then the bottom portion says, therefore, this one and the same person is known in two natures. And I won't dwell on this because it's a couple of books worth, but depending on how we describe and understand the word nature, that can be and evidently is interpreted as problematic by the non-Chalcedonians, who say that sounds too much like Nestorius, who had said he's two persons. So the preferred language of the non-Chalcedonians is the language of guess what? Our common father in God, Cyril of Alexandria, who said that, yes, Christ is consubstantial with God and consubstantial with us. But as a result, this one doubly consubstantial person has one incarnate nature, one nature as the incarnate Christ, one divino-human nature. And then quickly they add, unconfused. It's not a confused nature. It's not a nature where one swallows the other up, but rather both sets of characteristics are evident. All right? So these are two different ways of expressing the same reality, I think, and anyone else who thinks so, the onus is on us to explain why they are effectively saying the same thing. This is just kind of reviewing what I just said. In both cases, Christ is fully divine and fully human, one person. Now, just back to a point I was making earlier, the whole odyssey of the conciliar era and even the pre-conciliar era, those key formative centuries of Christian theology, was an odyssey of the reception and adaptation, adoption and adaptation of Greek philosophical terminology. And I would say, especially in the 4th century, several of these terms were in profound flux, such that, for example, hypostasis and usia were seen as synonymous with each other among some Christians and as meaning something different among other Christians. All right. Now, if you're one of these 4th century Christians who says hypostasis and usia are synonymous, how are you going to speak about God? Is God one hypostasis? Because by that we mean that he has one substance or one essence? Or is God 3 hypostases, in which case that sounds like 3 different substances, 3 different essences, all right? So whether you treat these 2 terms as synonymous or not has profound consequences for your theology. So it becomes incumbent upon sensitive and thinking persons, the fathers of the church, to actually inquire of each other, what do you mean by your terms? Because this isn't a club where you have a secret password that if you don't get the password right, you're not a member. It's theology. It's what do you teach about God? What do you teach about Christ? How are you using these words? And there are profound examples in the 4th century when it's this controversy. Like in the 5th century, it's how you're using the word physis, nature, that becomes pivotal. But in the 4th century, it's these terms that are pivotal. And our great father in God, Athanasius of Alexandria, there's a beautiful text. It's called the Tome to the Antiochenes. It's his letter after a council in the mid-4th century. And he reports being presented with different parties of Christians and was asked about their teachings. And so when he asks about their teaching, he says, and then we made inquiry as to what they meant. And in one case, he realizes that the people in front of him took hypostasis and usia as synonymous. And when he said, do you mean this? They were perfectly orthodox, where they were presented to him as being accused of a heresy of modalism. And so he writes as a result, he says, we exhort you not to hastily condemn or reject those who confess in this way, provided they explain the phrases they use, but rather accept them, since they desire peace and they defend themselves. Counsel those who explain hold the right not to inquire further into each other's opinions, nor to fight about words to no useful purpose, nor to go on contending with the above phrases, but to agree in the mind of piety. So the key here is, what do you mean by your terms? A few decades later, another theologian we know and revere, St. Gregory the Theologian, is reading his funeral oration of Athanasius. And he mentions this. He says, Athanasius the Great conferred in his gentle and sympathetic way with both parties, and after he had carefully weighed the meaning of their expressions, he found that they had the same sense without the slightest doctrinal difference. Putting to one side the question of terms, he fundamentally reconciled the two sides. And then perhaps taking his lesson from the same Athanasius in a later oration, the same St. Gregory the Theologian writes, let not those who are contentious on these points utter their scandalous taunts, as if our faith depended on terms and not on realities. It's your 4th century semiotics right here. There's the signifier and there's the signified. There's the word, which is not the same thing as the thing, right? If we're to communicate meaningfully, we have to inquire of each other's meanings. The same great theologian demonstrates how fragile church relations can be. Gregory the Theologian was, for a time, presiding over what we now call the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381. And it was a very depressing affair for him. He left in the middle of the council and writes in poetry in the end of his life as how difficult it was to hear this kind of contestation taking place. Bear in mind, he's talking about a council that we rightly revere as having given us the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. So it didn't end all that badly, but the process was really, really onerous and messy, as human history is. And he laments with this very beautiful image. He says, he summons this image, which I found a nice Google image search gave me this image of these hands drawing water up. He says, when our hands are dipped into water to bring them up to drink, some droplets are needlessly lost, trickling through the fingers. And he says, in this same way, there is a separation between us and not only those who are truly distant from us, right? There is genuine division. There is heresy in life. But there's a separation also of those who are most pious, and they are separated either over doctrines of small consequence or over expressions intended to bear the same meaning. Division over expressions intended to bear the same meaning. So, however we may apply this to the Eastern Oriental divide, there's still perhaps a debate to be had whether people meant, in fact, different things. But the key is to actually care. The key is to care enough to ask what is meant. And in so doing, we are following patristic precedent. So maybe 5-10 minutes more if you'll bear with me. And we'll have some discussion. I mentioned this 20th century theological dialogue that concludes in 1990 at Chambézy, Switzerland. And the assembled theologians there concluded very decisively that in fact, we mean the same thing with our different terms. And they express this in a very radical way that the churches are still reeling from, right? Okay, so imagine this is a gathering of theologians appointed by the official churches, right? So this has some kind of power here. This has some kind of authority, perhaps. And these gathered people say the following mind-blower statement. No, actually, here. We have now clearly understood that both families have always loyally maintained the same authentic Orthodox Christological faith and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, although they have used Christological terms in different ways. It is this common faith and continuous loyalty to the apostolic tradition that should be the basis for our unity and communion. You know, I'm pretty pro, formal ecclesiastical communion with the Oriental family, if you ask me, but I still kind of reel at this official statement. And guess what? So are the rest of the churches reeling from it. When you look at who's accepted this Chambézy statement, it's a much longer statement. It's the Coptic and Syrian and Malankara Orthodox churches that have received the 1990 agreement from the Oriental side. And from the Eastern side, Alexandria, the Romanian Orthodox Church, although they were so cut to the heart by the Athenite declaration that they sort of rescinded their approval of Chambézy. Antioch, Constantinople, being the kind of the primatial see, didn't want to sort of receive it ahead of the rest of the churches, so it welcomed Chambézy. And Moscow is still studying the question, and its approach is to have its own dialogues piecemeal with the Copts, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, etc. So that's where that is. And Mount Athos soundly rejects the Chambézy agreement. So that's just as a point of information. I realize I left out one pretty lovely pair of patristic quotations, because a lot of what I'm doing tonight is kind of trying to show how it is that it's not just modern ecumenists, we are the world types who think this is all beautiful and united, but it's the fathers of the church who saw A, the importance of terminology and meaning, B, the way that terms can sometimes incorrectly cause division, right? And C, that our impulse ought to be finally towards unity. And to hammer that point home, we have the third Cappadocian, well, I haven't gotten to Nyssa yet, but Basil the Great, whose efforts at union across apparent theological divides are well known in the 360s. And he writes, his letters are these masterpieces of theology and pastoral sensitivity. He says, much anxious thought must be taken Many sleepless nights must be passed, and with many tears must the truth be sought from God by the one who is on the point of cutting off from a brother's or sister's communion. I see that quote as very much a sister quotation of the one from Gregory the Theologian. You know, you cut something off and you lose some droplets you didn't want to lose. And once you've cut that off, it's so hard to bring it all back together. And then, so on the one hand, he's saying, be careful whom you sever. And on this other hand, he's also saying, in an earlier letter, he says, I think that the one great goal of all who are really and truly serving the Lord ought to be to bring back to union the church is now divided from one another. Nothing is so characteristically Christian as being a peacemaker. And for this reason, our Lord has promised us peacemakers a very high reward. Referring obviously to the Beatitudes. So just to conclude here, there are two possible stances to take when we consider really any ecclesiastical relationship. And both of them have patristic precedent, and both of them may be appropriate. And one of these is to say that the other side is wrong. They are in heresy. Think of the Arians, we think of the Nestorians, we think of the Apollinarians, we think of the Eutychians, right? If we think of whatever, we can go on and do our little private Synodicon of Orthodoxy and list all the heresies, right? So there is another side which is wrong, and if we are to be one with them, they have to repent and accept the Orthodox faith. But there are other circumstances where we can say, together with Chambézy, each side has expressed the same reality with different terms. And like the fathers, we focus on the realities and not the terms. So there are certainly Orthodox Christians who believe that the Eastern Oriental Sism is of that first category, that the others are wrong and that they must repent. And then there are also Orthodox Christians, the ones who are appointed by their churches, who conclude that the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox division in Rapprochement is best described by the second of these two. And like I said, it's the onus of those who have this sense that we do mean the same thing. The onus is on us to show it, to prove it, and to bring the church with us, even as we also stand ready to be convinced otherwise or reproached or whatever. But that's our task. And so again, to answer my question, no, we're not smarter than the fathers who anathematized each other in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. But the ensuing centuries have just given us more information, as hindsight often does. And what we're doing is doing exactly, I hope what we're doing is exactly what the fathers did with new information, namely acting on new information, prioritizing realities over terms, and prioritizing unity where it is theologically appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for so skillfully navigating this very difficult topic, but I think you've done a great job of illuminating both terms and meaning, and I personally feel very sort of rewarded and blessed for having heard what you said. Thank you very much. I like to run a tight ship when it comes to questions and answers, not to prevent people from asking questions, but to actually make time for more people to ask questions. So I will open the floor, but please try and formulate a question in your mind about 100 times and then deliver it, rather than sort of spending 3 minutes talking around the question and then asking a question. I think that helps other people, and there's more time for people to ask questions. So I think that's a fair comment on my side, if I do say so myself. So I'm mindful that we have about 40 people joining us on Zoom, so I'm sure there's questions or comments possibly from those joining us online. So we want to give them a fair share to contribute and to ask questions, equally to those of us present in the room, about almost 30 or 20 something. So, but I will start with a question which you might not be able to answer, Peter, simply because it's more of a maybe a church politics question, but it seems to me, and this is maybe drawing on your experience in the WCC, but it seems to me from what you're saying that a lot of the ecumenical effort that we see is with sort of Orthodox, Roman Catholics, Anglicans, sort of the churches that stem from the same, as it were, sort of Chalcedonian root.
Yes.
So a lot of effort is done in that sense. It's very visible. Some of it is more sort of successful than other elements of it, and less so, or less visibly so, this dialogue for unity and reconciliation is happening between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox. And it seems very puzzling, given that the distance, the difference, in a sense, seems to be less in very essential theological terms, also less in the way that we travel as churches, because both Eastern and Oriental sort of, they don't ordain women. We don't have all the other differences that we see developing with the other Christian churches. So why do you think this is the case? Why do you think that we have this more visible ecumenical effort on this side and so little, in the sense, on the other side, when it seems to have so little a hurdle, in a sense, to a hurdle nonetheless, but less than the one that, or the ones that we're experiencing on the other side? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, as often is the case in family systems, sometimes the disputes between the closest siblings can be the most scary or the most threatening, because we're so close, because we care about each other that much. From the outside, the evident spiritual, liturgical, patristic closeness between Eastern and Oriental families is a great, it's a matter of fear and threat to those who don't want to expand sort of our picture of this tent that is the church, So the memorandum from the Sacred Community of Mount Athos begins with an expression of profound fear and alarm. As I suggested, these unofficial and then official dialogues, they're so full of hope, and they're so full of optimism, and they're, like I mentioned, even I'm sort of, stunned by their conclusion. Well, that conclusion was so optimistic that, to speak as an American, it freaked everybody out. And it's certainly, when Mount Athos reacts to something, the Orthodox really listen to it. I would even say they're cowed by it in a certain way, as manifest in the case of Romania, which first received and then said, oh, no. So in a way, you could say that the dialogue had its big moment in the second half of the 20th century. And since then, we're all just reeling, trying to kind of recalibrate. I will say that in these coming years, there's a sense in which there's an exploration to could kind of take stock again and begin this dialogue. And to finish answering your question, in the meantime, the relationships, bilateral and multilateral, with other churches continue on their own terms.
Thank you very much. So if there's a question from here, from the audience in the room, do raise your hand, and then we'll try and alternate. So if anybody has a question from those joining us on Zoom, you're very welcome to type it in the chat, and then we can sort of work through them, and it saves time, and it's easier to sort of triage them like that. If you feel compelled to ask a question by speaking, you're welcome to do that as well, but you have the option that we don't have to type it in the chat. So let me give you the floor, because I think he was the first to raise the hand.
When we read the quotation from it felt to me that we are facing with two kinds of orthodoxy, one of Gregory the theologian and one of today. For Gregory, reality was higher than the term, but for today, and even in the theological schools of today, Orthodox theology, we are taught that terms and reality are not superior to terms, because of the equivalence between faith and practice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, the kinds of education and discussion that we're talking about is often within one closed system, where there is a presumed agreement of what the terms and realities are. So there's less of a necessity of checking. I happen to think it's always a good idea to check, what do you mean? In any relationship, but if you are in a classroom in Sofia or in Yash or in Moscow or wherever, and the terms hypostasis and feces come up, you can use them with some confidence that you have some sense of what they mean. But once that classroom includes a wider diversity of people, it becomes even more necessary to ask what they mean. Yeah.
There's a question on the chat.
Quick question, if I.
Sorry, I'll just ask the question by Elke. Does Mount Athos speak as a single entity?
I don't know enough the Athonite kind of system, but there is a body that I believe that consists in representatives from the different monastic communities on Mount Athos that meets as needed, and it hasn't made statements on a regular basis, but in times of perceived crisis, such as this one, it has. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every single monastic you might ask on the Holy Mountain would have the same answer.
I think there's a question here. Maybe, Trisha, you raise your hand.
Mine is really more of an observation, which I think, as Peter probably knows good and well, I'm the head of Oxia Women, and all of our events include Eastern and Oriental participants. And I have to say, it makes for an incredibly rich dialogue, as we're coming at the same subject from the same, it feels like the very same theological point of view, but with different spiritual emphases. And it makes for an incredibly rich blessing every single time we hold one of these events. I'm just saying, it's a huge pity more people don't get a chance to experience that. That wasn't a question, I just wanted to put it out there. So
Thank you. Yeah.
The question on the chat. Sorry.
Yes, so the question is, earlier in the lecture you mentioned there were issues that need to be addressed dealt with, such as the sainthood of popes, Dioscoros and Leo. How do you envisage we deal with these issues?
When Father John Meyendorff was asked that question, and he has an article in the St. Vladimir's Quarterly about the Eastern and Oriental Union, his answer was, well, in the Orthodox Church, there is such a thing as local venerations of saints. I'm not sure that that really works in this case, because it's one thing for the Peterburgskaya oblasts to venerate Saint Ksenia for a century or two before she's canonized, and it's another thing for someone locally to venerate a saint that another truly considers the other as a heretic. So I think the issue can't simply be, unity in diversity of veneration. I think we have to reckon, as we are reckoning, with what Dioscorus actually holds, what he was censured for at Chalcedon, what is the theology of Severus, with his quite idiosyncratic use of these same terms, and then how to read the tome of Leo I in a way that's not Nestorian. So until there can be some kind of rapprochement at that level, we have something that one would call at least a tension that needs resolution.
There's a question here. Yes.
I think this only might happen over Athonite dead bodies. So do you think there could be a possibility of the Oriental Church being in communion with Antioch and Constantinople, maybe Alexandria, and then put the Athonite and Russian communion later? Or do you think that it will have to all work as one?
It's a crucial question. Do Brits also say that's above my pay grade? Because that's how I would answer it. It's something that I am not in a position to address. I will quote again Father John Meyendorff, who said that ultimately union, a truly organic union between Eastern and Orientals would result in there being one and not two patriarchs of Alexandria, one and not two patriarchs of Antioch. Good luck sorting out who that's going to be. And at least as an interim solution, there would be a wider and more pervasively recognized intercommunion. But the key question you ask is, how universally can it be recognized? There certainly is very sad precedent for locally excommunicating each other's churches, as right now, tragically, over the Ukraine question, and then 30 years ago with the Estonia question, there was a fragmentation of communion between Constantinople and Moscow. This is not something that one seeks to encourage or foment, but ultimately, I again, just as a matter, since you asked just an opinion, 2016 in the Council at Crete, the Holy and Great Council, indicates to us that at least there's a possibility of trying to gather the churches to deliberate on issues. What was deliberated on in 2016, can you tell me? Fasting, different questions like that. But if this Eastern Oriental rapprochement became central enough, and if there was confidence that it was ready for that level of deliberation, it ought actually to happen at the inter-Orthodox level, such that nobody would be left behind and playing catch up, in the idea.
Thank you. We'll take a question from the chat and then come back to the to here. There are several comments that say congratulations and thank you for your talk, Peter. We thank people for their feedback. I think there's in many areas there is only one Oriental Orthodox Church, so the family of the priest or the priest is unable to go to confession to an Eastern Orthodox priest nearby because their bishop has not permitted this. How could this be addressed?
I'd say, especially as professor of systematic theology at St. Vladimir Seminary, I can only say, listen to your bishop. There are a wide number of localities and of bishops from all who sit on all kinds of sides of this, the spectrum of diversity of Orthodox approaches to things, who welcome Eritreans and others who don't have a communion location nearby. So in the East, they are received for communion with the blessing of the bishop. Where there is no such blessing, I'm extremely sorry to hear about it, and it's really a matter of you and whoever is your spiritual director. And I do think these decisions, not just speaking in my official capacity, but these decisions are best made in council and in accountability to a spiritual director.
Thank you. It's also wonderful to hear that Orthodox priests do go to confession or want to go to confession.
Right.
Yes, Matt. Yes, please. Yeah.
You talk a lot about, and excellently about terminology, the importance of terminology. And obviously, from the Eastern side, you have the definition of Chalcedon. And it's great to hear about the Miaphysite stuff from the other side. But do the Oriental churches, in their diversity of the 5th, 6th centuries, have any kinds of statements that are commensurate in authority to Chalcedon, to which you can actually compare the use of terminology?
The short answer to that question is no. Apart from the kind of the credo of Cyril of Alexandria, that in Christ is known by one incarnate nature, that is the closest that you'd get to some kind of a universally authoritative statement after Ephesus. And you're pointing to another issue that I think was implicit in what I was saying, and that is that the ties that bind the Eastern Orthodox churches together as one church are very different from what binds the Oriental churches, both in their episcopal authority and in their theology. You know, there's no accountability, as I was saying earlier, of Armenian theology to Ethiopian theology to even to Syrian theology. Even as, you know, by God's grace, they're all getting to know each other better, and there are some kind of ad hoc local allegiances between Armenian, Syrian, and Coptic churches in the Middle East, but it's a less homogenized body. So that's part of the answer to your question too.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Peter. I think it chimes in with a comment by Michael Ibrahim there on the screen, which is further down. This one here, it says that Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox understanding of family or communion of churches is different. The Oriental Orthodox have less issue with diversity, since this is our lived experience. How much do you think Eastern Orthodox needs for uniformity hinders dialogue? My observation is that each group is more fixed on dialogue with the larger groups. So whilst the Oriental Orthodox are very focused on Eastern Orthodox is fixated on Rome, would dialogue be better served if each group focused on the little brother? Yes.
So there's two very different questions lodged in there, and I'll only address the first one, which is an Eastern Orthodox focus on uniformity a hindrance to dialogue? And I think there's no simple universal answer to that question, because there are aspects of the uniformity of our faith that are, and our practice and our liturgy, that are tremendous gifts that I would not want to compromise or sacrifice. I think it's a case-by-case question of what, in the case of a term, or in the case of a practice, or in the case of a liturgical formula, what here is truly essential, and what can be done or expressed differently without any loss of integrity, without any loss of data. That question is one that we have to be ready to ask. But I wouldn't just simply say, wow, the Eastern Orthodox just need to be less focused on uniformity, because there is also good uniformity. There's uniformity in truth as well. So it's a case-by-case question, but it's a good question.
Yeah. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture. I could have listened for another hour, not just the 10 minutes you gave us. But I'm interested. You said, you acknowledged at the beginning about the framework of Greek thought, and then you comment on meaning. I wonder to what extent in the dialogues and discussions the issue of specifically of language comes to the fore. So it's interesting that a lot of the non-Chalcedonian group are either peripheral or outside of the old Roman Empire, and they speak different languages. And
yes,
how much does that actually feature in the discussions, that the Ethiopians can't say certain things and the Armenians?
Yeah,
I'm just interested to know whether
it's like in the modern dialogues.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It's a really good question. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll take a question from the audience, and then we'll actually two with Alexander, Christopher and Alexander, and then go back to some of the questions on the chat. We'll give it another sort of 10 minutes all in all. I think they should cover all the questions, well, depending on the answers.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. My question is about semiotics, because you raised this question yourself. And it seems to me that with respect to the question that you raised, the dialogue between Orthodox and Oriental Church is actually quite difficult to decide according to what criteria one could know whether the same sign or word has the same meaning. Because we can never, we can only talk about Christ in a particular way. It's always linguistically mediated, as semioticians or philosophers of language would put it today. And so that's kind of difficult. But on the other hand, we see already in the first centuries that there was this plurality, in the canon. For instance, if we ask ourselves, is the Christology of Matthew compatible with the Christology of the Gospel of John? It's actually, when we're honest, it's a similar question. And the church just decided in its wisdom that maybe not saying the same thing, but it's compatible. And maybe it's a similar question, the dialogue. Would you agree with this analysis?
Yeah, within your question, is there the implication that the Christology of Matthew and the Christology of John are not simply have different emphases, but they actually have conflict with each other?
I think I would go so far, maybe. If one could read it like this, I think so.
Well, so part of the answer to the question lies with finding something like a patristic consensus drawing on Scripture. Father George Florovsky famously said, tradition is Scripture properly understood. So Scripture is still the key to everything, but how we emphasize it and what passages we emphasize and how we contextualize them is the whole thing. And so I think the fathers willy-nilly sort out the Matthean, Johannine lines, and I think they love John so much they probably just go John. But I mean, no, quite seriously, they identify that consensus. As to figuring out what each other mean across linguistic divides and terminological divides, I think it all has to do with, can we say the same thing with different words? we ask each other that kind of clarification all the time, you know. My wife and I certainly do. What did she mean? Could you restate that in different words? You know, Peter, say it again. Oh, good. Say it the second way you just said it, you know. Now, there were attempts in the 5th, 6th centuries to restate Chalcedon without using the word nature. You know, the Henoticon of Zeno, and it didn't take somehow, but it was a good idea. And I think that some of our continuing dialogue across the churches is ought to involve an exercise of stating our Christology without the same terms. Jesus Christ is one person. As the Son of God, he embodies and expresses everything that it is to be God. And as the Son of Mary, the Theotokos, he embodies and expresses everything that it is to be human, yet he is one person. You know, things like that which don't rely on saying, oh, that means he has, you know, mia physis tu theologus es argument. Well, you know, even that you can say, well, as this one divine or human person, he has one composite set of characteristics. You know, I didn't use the word nature, but, you know, so I think that's where the creative work comes, once one has the desire to actually understand each other.
Thank you. Sorry, just a footnote, a brief comment, and then the question. So the footnote is about the linguistic thing. That was certainly something that was a core issue in the seminars on Christology after Chalcedon that Sebastian Brock used to run with Metropolitan Callistos. So those issues came up there. So about the liturgical issue. Leaving aside the bruising experience of the church in the Russian Empire with the Niconian reform, I think that liturgical diversity is not so much of a problem in some other parts of the Orthodox world. When you had the Archbishop Gregorius of blessed memory here celebrating the liturgy of Saint Gregory the Theologian on his name day. So I think that in and of itself might not, but whether it might be more a question of habit or habituation with what Father Ephraim Lash used to call the hymns of hate that we sing at various times of year, or the type of sort of folk wisdom about things. Is the Trisagion Christological or Trinitarian? And then, but my real question has to do with, it was just interesting to me that St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Basil, and the others, the fathers that you were quoting about seeing that the same truth was being expressed in different ways, the same meaning, that they weren't talking about Chalcedonians, not Chalcedonians. Right. They were talking about people that we would call Arians or maybe even semi-Arians. Yes. And I'm just wondering if you would think that'd be so much further apart. And I wonder if we could comment just a little bit more on that, what that means for us today, that they could be so charitable to people who were to us would be, well, they're Arians. I mean, that would be just, you know, completely on the other side of things.
Right. So yeah, I guess what you're pointing to is a methodological, you know, problem or whatever that I'm quoting basically anachronistically. I'm quoting something from a century earlier and applying it to an issue a century later. But yes, what I'm trying to do is point to an impulse that prioritizes meaning. And then it's up to us to see how that can apply to other later situations. Prioritizing meaning as an impulse when you have the desire to actually humanize the other, hypostasize the other, and be in communion with the other. So it's no longer the same terms that are in play for Basil and Gregory and Athanasius in the 5th century, but it's the same impulse, I'm arguing. And I haven't yet gotten to the part of the book where there is a search for terminological consensus in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries.
I'm sorry, I don't have the mic. Just saying, I think my basic point was trying to say it was if they could do that with Arians, why can't we do this?
Oh, I see. Right. If they can do this across such a great divide, then it should be easier to do it with a narrow one. Okay. I mean, I think if you asked Cyril or Dioscorus or Maximus that, oh, this is nothing, they'd say, what? This is as urgent as any theological divide. But I appreciate your impulse as well.
Greg, could you make the chat big? So I'll just read the questions from the chat. Basically, starting with what do you think seminaries in the diaspora are going to play? What role are they thinking in the reconciliation of both Orthodox families? How has it been like teaching classes with mixed Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox Christians?
Yeah, I always say, because I actually believe that teaching at a seminary that has students of both families is a tremendous gift. It's not even a onerous challenge. How am I going to do this? No, it's a tremendous gift because I think like anybody who tries to take theology seriously, I don't always manage, but it constantly keeps you on your toes. It constantly makes you prioritize also. What am I meaning? What am I meaning by this? How can I express the theology of the Chalcedonian Church, to which I belong, which I do not retreat from, but in a way that is understandable and commensurate with the theology of Cyril and that side. So I do that in my regular kind of dogmatics classes, and I also have taught for many years now a small kind of high-level seminar on precisely this church relationship, its history, its just the kinds of stuff we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
So I think by God's grace, our seminary is committed to and trying to advance this in these ways of keeping ourselves together, as Patricia was saying too, like listening to each other and not suppressing the diversity that we find among each other, but really inhabiting it.
Yeah, thank you. No, I resonate with you because I think shaping people, students, seminarians to think in terms of meaning rather than giving them the tools to bludgeon themselves to death with terms in the future, as we tend to do, is the way forward, basically. And this sort of co-ed, I mean, in a sense, education, I think, is the way forward as a shared.
I'll leave it at we pray together, but we don't receive the Eucharist together. And I think we need to be constantly presented with the pain of being out of communion with each other.
Yeah, I agree.
Very few people experience that pain.
Yeah.
But it's an important pain because it's real. It's the reality. It's part of the picture. As rosily as I can quote Basil about unity, we don't have it. And here I am piously receiving the Eucharist, and then I look back and there's the Copts and the Indians standing in the back of the church.
Yeah. Well, it hits home, there was a comment from Sherry, and I think there will be more or less the last one we're going for. So thanks for the excellent talk. I find the communion issue theologically difficult. She's an Anglican, Sherry, making us all aware, for the priest or bishop to deny communion or other sacraments because he thinks the other is not a communicant, is to exercise the legitimate stewardship of the church, even if he is mistaken. But to excommunicate, believing the Lord holds the other to be a communicant, is to act against what he believes to be the will of the Lord. It is to say to Christ that I may not be with the other person as he chooses. We saw one casting out devils in your name, but we forbade him, except worse, it is Christ himself who is being forbidden. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a deadly serious matter, and as I was just saying before the question came up, it is profoundly painful. And in those cases where I've come to an Orthodox church with a non-Orthodox friend, and they weren't necessarily even aware that they couldn't receive communion, and I've been involved in weeping conversations over this matter. So there's nothing to say to sort of console that pain. There is, however, I can see how it looks as if it's like a priest who is willfully deciding to exclude the other because they're not part of the right club, or because they're just, I don't know, that it's a matter of exclusion. Whereas what the clergy are doing is being obedient to an ecclesiastical reality.
Yeah.
It's one that we find lamentable, maybe in some cases, but we can't, either as clergy or as laity, behave entirely on our own feelings and impulses on these matters. There has to be an accountability to ecclesiastical reality, and as I said, to not avoid feeling that pain, but also but to avoid using communion as a bludgeon, or using communion as a means of exclusion. And where that impression is given, I really understand how you come away with that impression. One has to spend a lot of time explaining why that ought not be the case, and in truth is not the case.
Thank you. I want to thank all the people who asked questions, both in the room and online. I know, I mean, just a comment.
As an Oriental Orthodox Christian, I just want to say that you're a wonderful ambassador for both sides. So thank you very, very much.
So thank you for your comments. I'm sorry we didn't get to read all of the comments out loud, but we did read them here. The screen was sort of maximized, and we could see what you were saying. By those comments, I can see that there's maybe room for maybe another book after you finish this one. So there's certainly room for discussion and for consideration and for prayer. So thank you all for participating, and special thanks to Peter for your wonderful, wonderful talk. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to pray about, but also I think a lot of hope that not all is lost, and that we might yet find a way by God's grace to reach a union or communion, or certainly a greater unity. So we're going to enjoy some wine and dips and sandwiches here, and some coffee. This is a message for all of those of you in the comfort of your home. So please make sure that you yourselves, depending on the time of day, enjoy the appropriate beverage. But again, thank you for being with us. You've enriched our lecture this evening by your participation and questions. God bless you all. We look forward to seeing you at other events. And for all of you celebrating Christmas, whom we're not going to see, Merry Christmas to you and a wonderful Nativity season. Thank you so much. God bless you all. Thank you.